Good evening. Your Majesty, Consul Cadena, Commissioners Regalado and Soto, member of the board of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute, Professor Richard Kagan, distinguished friends of the Institute. Welcome to this roundtable discussion, La Primera Globalización, the voyage that shaped the world. My name is Begonia Santos, and I am the Executive Director of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute. The Institute is honored to continue carrying its mission forward today in the great city of Miami. Founded in 1954 by a group of American Hispanophiles passionate about Spain and the Spanish-speaking world, the Institute sought to stimulate Americans' interest in the art, culture, customs, language, literature, and history of Spain and the Spanish-speaking world. Today, the Institute keeps this vision current by striving to share the contributions of the Spanish speakers to the history and culture of the United States and by showcasing the excellence of the Spanish-speaking world in numerous fields. It is with this mission in mind that we gather here today, in the year that marks the 500th anniversary of the completion of the voyage that changed world history. It is an honor to have with us tonight 4 world-renowned experts in the early modern period of the history of Spain and its empire. The history of the first voyage around the world is not solely part of the history of Spain. It is also the personal history and the personal story of an immense array of people, men and women from almost every corner of the globe, who were put in touch as a result of this circumnavigation. Their deeply interconnected narratives, the cross-influences that they developed, the long-distance relationships that were established, make this event both a global and a very personal, intimate one simultaneously. All these men and women, whether in the ships or in the territories where the ships arrived, contributed to this first globalization, to an amazing exchange of language and of knowledge in the fields of botany, medicine, astronomy, cartography, zoology, navigation techniques, and so on and on. This proliferation of connections and exchanges, these new planetary bonds, created a new reality unprecedented in human history that deeply touched and transformed all persons involved. This new era of exploration and mobility of people and goods triggered human and material changes comparable to, if not greater than, those brought by modern technology. A new look at this first globalization, with its lights and shadows, is sure to shed much needed light to our modern times, so we can understand and navigate them better. The Queen Sofia Spanish Institute would like to warmly thank Her Majesty Queen Sofia for her constant support of the Institute's mission and its activities, and for her presence here tonight. Her Majesty also attended the inaugural presentation of the Biographical Dictionary of the Royal Academy of History and the Sofia Award for Excellence dinner, both in New York last March. We could not be happier to have you with us again. Thank you so much for your presence, Your Majesty. The Institute would also like to recognize Banco Sabadell for their support of today's event and the Perez Art Museum of Miami for hosting us tonight. Thank you for your attention and welcome to the roundtable. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Institute's board member and head of our cultural committee, Professor Richard Kagan of Johns Hopkins University. Thank you.
Thank you, Begonia, Your Majesty. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that you're all here this evening in person. It's important to attend this, the first of several events in Miami, sponsored by the Queen Sofía Spanish Institute in New York. As you are undoubtedly all aware, these events, starting with this evening's roundtable, have been timed to coincide with the visit to Miami of the wonderful Spanish tall ship Elcano, which is docked just just behind me. The ship is named after Juan Sebastian Elcano, the Basque seafarer and captain who accompanied Magellan on his momentous voyage, starting in Spain to the Pacific, to the Spice Islands, roughly today's in Indonesia, starting in 1519. The voyage took Magellan and his fleet across the Atlantic, down the east coast of South America, and then to the Pacific via the straits at the tip of South America that still bears Magellan's name, and then on to the Philippines. It was there that Magellan, following a confrontation with a local chieftain and his men, met, unfortunately, his end. But Elcano and a small group of sailors survived, and in their one remaining vessel, laden with spices that they had managed to acquire, probably in Sumatra, they sailed westwards across the Indian Ocean, and a voyage that, following routes previously pioneered by the Portuguese and possibly some Chinese vessels as well. They went around the Cape of Good Hope into the Atlantic, finally managing, after 3 years, lacked almost a week after the voyage began, they found their way back to Spain, and in doing so completed, to the best of anyone's knowledge, the very first circumnavigation that ever occurred. Much has been written about this celebrated voyage, the trials and tribulations of its survivors who made it back to Spain. But the purpose of this roundtable is less to provide a narrative of the event itself, but to explore its repercussions and the beginnings of what historians refer to as the start of what is called globalization, or the first globalization, a phenomenon with which we are all familiar. And towards this end, the Institute has assembled a group of distinguished scholars, each renowned specialists in their particular fields, to discuss different aspects of this early globalization. These include implications of the Magellan-Elcano voyage for ships and maritime routes, as well as for commerce and trade during the early modern world. A related topic is one that springs from Magellan's interest in the Spice Islands, the early modern traffic in such valued commodities as spices, pepper, for example, along with coffee, silver, gems, and not to mention cochineal, the dye that comes from a small Mexican bug that, when crushed, produced a dye that's known as the perfect red. Some of you are probably wearing some cochineal garments. We will also explore the effects of that voyage upon the movement of peoples and settlements around the world, and finally its impact in the realm of ideas, the territorial aspirations of powerful rulers, cartography, and the like. It's a tall order, and we'll try to begin on time. Our first speaker is Carla Rand Phillips, who taught at the University of Minnesota for many years and retired as the Union Pacific Professor in Comparative Early Modern History. She is currently affiliated with the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. And her scholarly work focuses on the economic and social history of Spain and its overseas connections from the late 15th century to the early 18th century, especially the history of seafarers and the sea. Her maritime publications include 6 galleons for the King of Spain, Imperial Defense in the early 17th century, 1986, won an important prize. She also wrote The Treasure of San Jose, Death at Sea, and the War of the Spanish Succession, which appeared in 2007, and The Struggle for the South Atlantic, The Armada of the Strait, 1581 to 1584. And with her husband, William, she also found time to publish a biography of Christopher Columbus. She authored a prize-winning book on the Spanish trade in wool and a concise history of Spain itself. She is a corresponding member of Spain's Royal Academy of History and holds an encomienda in the Noble Order of Isabella la Católica. Carla.
Thank you, Richard. Your Majesty, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, The expedition begun by Ferdinand Magellan in September of 1519 and completed by Juan Sebastian Elcano in September 1522 is one of the most famous in the history of global exploration. But should we view it as a heroic legend or a cautionary tale? As we approach the 500th anniversary of Elcano's return to Spain, the individuals, context, and events of the voyage can help us to understand its full history and consequences. Magellan was Portuguese, born in about 1480 to a minor noble family. In his youth, he spent several years at the royal court in Lisbon when Portugal was becoming a leader in oceanic exploration. Loyal, brave, ambitious, and somewhat quarrelsome, Magellan served as a soldier in North and East Africa, India, and East Asia. He fought well and learned about trade, politics, and society wherever he went. But he approached the age of 40 without much in the way of fame and fortune. Elcano was born in 1487 in the Basque Country of northern Spain, a region closely linked to seafaring and home to generations of distinguished mariners, and he presumably went to sea at an early age. He fought in the periodic wars that involved Spain in Italy and North Africa, but he also spent his first several decades in relative obscurity. As for context, the ruling monarchs of Spain and Portugal settled a long war in 1479, but their rivalry to claim lands outside Iberia continued. In 1494, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas that defined spheres of influence for further exploration. Portugal could send voyages south and east, consolidating their pioneering route around Africa. Spain could send voyages south and west, adding to claims being made by Columbus and others at the time. It remained unclear what the line established at Tordesillas meant on the other side of the globe. The great prize was to claim the legendary Spice Islands and establish trade. But where did they lie with relation to the line implied by the treaty? Portugal had already arrived at the Far East by sailing south and east. Spain needed to find a westward route. Columbus and at least a dozen other explorers sailed with that goal in mind. And with a picture of the Western Ocean, minus the Americas, that is hard for us to comprehend. Although Magellan probably never reached the Spice Islands, he learned about them during his time in the Far East. And for various reasons, he came to believe that they lay on the Spanish side of the line. Back in Lisbon, he spoke openly about that idea, hoping to persuade, by then, King Manuel I to reinforce the Portuguese presence in the Far East. Instead, Magellan's notions irritated the king, and his rough manners and repeated requests for an increase in his stipend made things worse. In a final stormy audience, King Manuel dismissed Magellan from his service, freeing him to seek another patron. Spain was a logical choice, since Magellan thought the Spice Islands lay in the Spanish sphere. Before crossing the border, however, Magellan spent more than a year refining his ideas in partnership with the brilliant but unstable mathematician and cosmographer Rui Faleiro. He also contacted Portuguese residents in Spain and gathered more information. He surely heard that a Spanish expedition that returned in 1516 had reached the Rio de la Plata, which was broad enough to suggest it was a passage through the land. Magellan and a small entourage arrived in Seville in October 1517. His timing was ideal. Spain's first Habsburg king, Carlos I, 17-year-old grandson of Isabel and Ferdinand, was anxious to impress his new subjects, especially at the expense of Portugal. Magellan almost immediately gained the support of important merchants and officials in the House of Trade in Seville, and through them of the king himself. Before the expedition sailed, the king made both Magellan and Faleiro knights in the prestigious Order of Santiago. The fondest hope of many explorers was to be named to one of the military orders after they had succeeded to be rewarded in advance was virtually unprecedented. Spanish merchants and financiers would profit handsomely if Spain could control trade with the Spice Islands. The merchant Cristobal de Haro offered to finance the voyage, but the king decided that the crown would underwrite most of the expense. He and his advisors also wrote contracts, detailed instructions, and other documents designed to make the crown's control of the voyage clear and legally binding. Similar documents that defined earlier voyages of exploration covered how the leader and the senior officers should regularly consult with one another, how and by whom trade should be conducted, how and by whom relations with local people should be carried out, and so on. The king's advisors realized that these contracts and instructions were particularly important because Magellan and Faleiro were Portuguese, and their professed loyalty to King Carlos had not been tested. At the urging of the very important Bishop Fonseca, the king named Don Juan de Cartagena, a noble courtier and member of the palace guard, as Inspector General of the expedition to ensure, as the king wrote to the House of Trade, that, quote, the said Portuguese follow the prescribed route, close quote, and obey all the other stipulations in the documents issued for the voyage. If Magellan and Faleiro both died, Cartagena would become leader of the expedition. He was later named as captain of one of the expedition's 5 ships, the San Antonio. As the departure date approached, Faleiro's behavior became increasingly erratic. The king removed him from the expedition by July of 1519 and designated Cartagena as conjunta persona with Magellan, literally joint person. It is not clear what that title meant, but it implied that Cartagena held equal command status with Magellan as Faleiro's replacement. The expedition left Sanlúcar de Barrameda in September 1519, sailing southwest to the Canary Islands. Magellan consulted with the other officers before departure and in the Canary Islands to agree upon a course, as his instructions required. After leaving the Canaries, however, he deviated sharply from that course and refused to consult further. Cartagena, as Inspector General and conjunta persona with Magellan, challenged that high-handed behavior. In retaliation, Magellan arrested Cartagena for, quote, insubordination, close quote, and substituted his cousin, Álvaro de Mesquita, as captain of the San Antonio, though legally Cartagena was not Magellan's subordinate, and he had a right and duty to challenge him when he failed to follow royal instructions. A 2-week layover in Rio de Janeiro, in Portuguese Brazil, marked a sort of truce between Magellan and the senior Spanish officers, but relations worsened when they headed south again. Facing increasing cold, wind, heavy seas, failure to find a passage through the land, the loss of one ship, and damage to the other 4, they took refuge in the bay they called San Julián on 31 March 1520, the day before Easter. That night, Gaspar de Quesada and Luis de Mendoza, noblemen who captained 2 of the ships, plus Juan de Cartagena, Elcano, and others, some 40 in all, rose up against Magellan and demanded that he share information about the route and otherwise obey the king's instructions. After negotiations failed, Magellan and his allies put down the challenge. He condemned the so-called mutineers to death, though only 2 were killed, Mendoza and Quesada, the highest-ranking Spaniards on the voyage, apart from Cartagena. Their 2 dead bodies were quartered and hung on a gibbet to rot for the 5 months the ships remained at San Julián. The other men condemned were shackled and assigned to the worst jobs related to the ship's refitting. Magellan presumably did not dare to execute Don Juan de Cartagena directly, so he marooned him and a French chaplain on a small island to face a slow death in that unforgiving environment. The expedition finally found the entrance to the strait at 52 degrees 30 minutes south latitude and emerged on the other side after investigating many dead ends. Exploring one of them, the San Antonio's crew overpowered Captain Mesquita and returned to Spain, carrying many of the remaining supplies with them. The horrors at San Julian and the desertion of the San Antonio seem finally to have persuaded Magellan to follow instructions. He consulted his remaining officers and obtained consensus to continue into the vast Pacific Ocean. After additional hardships and the onset of scurvy among the crew, they reached Guam and then the Philippines, with ample opportunities to trade for fresh food. Magellan established good relations with many local rulers and effected impressive conversions to Christianity. But then he foolishly intervened in a local dispute in April 1521 on Mactan Island, where he was killed along with many of his senior officers. Others were ambushed and killed shortly thereafter, supposedly betrayed by Magellan's Malay slave Enrique for refusing to honor Magellan's will to grant his freedom. The expedition's survivors burned the least seaworthy of their remaining 3 ships and fled the Philippines in the other 2 ships. After Magellan's death, several challenges to leadership took place several changes in leadership took place according to standard procedures in Spain's maritime tradition, as the ships sailed southward toward the Spice Islands. Gonzalo Gómez de Espinosa, the expedition's chief constable, kept order among the men under difficult circumstances and was elected captain of Trinidad. Elcano was elected captain of Victoria and treasurer of the fleet. They reached the Spice Islands in December 1521, made agreements with local rulers, and traded for spices. Then, in agreement with Gómez de Espinosa, Elcano sailed Victoria west around the Cape of Good Hope, avoiding Portuguese enclaves and enduring near starvation, and consciously knowing that they were in Portuguese territory. Gómez was delayed in Asia by damage to Trinidad, and after failing to find an eastward route across the Pacific toward Panama, became a prisoner of the Portuguese. Elcano and his crew arrived back in Spain in September 1522 to great acclaim, knowing that they had gone around the world. Elcano sailed with Garcia de Loaiza through the strait again in 1525, but he died of scurvy in the mid-Pacific the following year. History has largely forgotten Gómez de Espinosa, whom the Portuguese eventually moved to Lisbon, where he was released in 1527 at the request of King Carlos. With a generous royal pension, he held a post in the House of Trade and seems to have lived at least until 1538. The human toll of the Magellan-Elcano voyage was high, as these numbers attest. And though the expedition has often been considered a financial success because the sale of spices on Victoria covered the full cost, the bankers who had financed 23% of that cost were not reimbursed until years later. The logs of the expedition's pilots show that the Spice Islands did not lie on the Spanish side of the Tordesillas line, but Spain nonetheless profited from continued uncertainty about Asian geography. In 1529, King Carlos gave up Spanish claims to the Spice Islands in exchange for 350,000 ducats from his Portuguese brother-in-law, King João III, and Spain also retained possession of the Philippines. In 1529 as well, Diogo Ribeiro summarized the extraordinary increase in knowledge about the eastern outline of the Americas. The western outline, however, remained largely unknown. Passage through the strait named for Magellan was far too difficult for regular trade, and the Pacific Ocean challenged even the most intrepid explorers. After Magellan-Elcano and Loaiza, Spanish exploration of the Pacific departed from New Spain or Peru, avoiding the strait. And the return route eastward from Asia to the Americas was not discovered until 1565 by Andrés de Urdaneta, more than 4 decades after Magellan. As late as the 1540s, some European mapmakers depicted Japan close to the coast of New Spain, long after the Magellan-Elcano voyage had suggested the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. For the Spanish crown, that voyage reinforced the value of clear rules and procedures, a well-defined hierarchy of command, and the need to retain control of overseas exploration and the administration of lands and peoples discovered, incorporated, and conquered in the process. To return to my initial question, should we view the Magellan-Elcano expedition as a heroic legend or a cautionary tale? Like many famous events in human history, it was both, and we would do well to keep that ambiguity in mind.
Thank you so much, Carla, for that enlightening episode in human history. Chris Lane, our next speaker, holds the Franz V. Scholz Chair in Colonial Latin American History at Tulane University in New Orleans. He is the author of Pandemic in Potosi, Fear, Loathing, and Public Policy in a Colonial Mining Metropolis, which came out just last year. He's also the author of Potosi, the Silver City That Changed the World, came out in 2019. He's the author of Pillaging the Empire, Piracy in the Americas, 1500 to 1750, 2015, I'm going backwards, and Color of Paradise, The Emerald in the Age of Gunpowder Empires in 2010. And before that, Quito, 1599, City and Colony in Transition. He's been very busy of late. Chris is currently writing a history, several histories of Potosi, different aspects of Potosi history in the course of the 17th century. I'd like to introduce him to you all. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Richard. It's really a pleasure and a joy to be here, Your Majesty, distinguished guests. And I have to say, a very hard act to follow. One of my teachers, Professor Carla Phillips, whose work I have admired for forever. She offers a master class. I just want to add, for those of you young folks in the audience, don't forget to take your vitamin C. Globalization, as we see it today, is something we take for granted. We fly around the world without much thought, although it may not be as cheap as we might like. Here in the port of Miami, we think of globalization coming to the city with cargo ships and cruise ships moving people and commodities in unheard of quantities. Sea traffic today is busier than ever, and from outer space, it is possible to track with satellites the movement of so many ships, so many tankers. And with different images, we begin to imagine that the sea is a very busy place, quite the opposite of what it was when Elcano and Magellan made their way around the world. It is hard for us to imagine a world like theirs, a world without the technologies that we take for granted, a time when one imagined that in the sea there were monsters and that Japan lay just beyond the far horizon. And it seems that for Elcano and Magellan, this voyage was, in fact, a kind of almost insane adventure. If you read the book, a very fine book by Felipe Fernandez Armesto, Straits, it just came out with the University of California Press, this is the story that you gain, that the expedition was a failure, but also a surprising success. It was both at the same time. Just as Professor Phillips has told us, the ambiguity of the story is what grips us. But what was this about? It was about fortune, not so much about fame. And how was it that this voyage, for all of its troubles, managed to make money? Early modern Europeans traded with one another, and they traded with the East, and they traded with Africa, and eventually with Columbus they reached the Americas. What were they searching for? They were searching for commodities, commodities that they lacked: gold and silver and spices and dyes and gemstones, these various things that drove them abroad. And it was the Iberians, the Portuguese and the Spanish, as you've heard, in close competition with one another, seeking the route to Cathay, that is, the route to the Indies. African gold was the first commodity of great significance for the Iberians to tap into, as there was a desperate need for gold as a money commodity to exchange throughout the Mediterranean and European worlds. And Columbus, when he reached the Americas, very quickly came upon gold in the Caribbean. Extracting gold using indigenous forced workers and soon after enslaved Africans, not just in the Caribbean, but in Mexico, in Central America, and probably most importantly, what is today Colombia, New Granada. But it was the silver of Potosi, what is today in the highlands of Bolivia, that changed the world in the sense of linking global trade with a money commodity on a scale never seen before. Meanwhile, Brazil took its name from a red dyewood that was found along the coast, and this wood was used to dye cloth, and it was the best red dye available until the discovery of cochineal, as as Richard explained. The first globalization then linked all of these different parts of the world in a fairly speedy way, but it wasn't until the 1570s that the Pacific was regularly crossed, as Professor Phillips mentioned. The Columbian Exchange may be known to some of you, and what I want to propose today is to think of the Magellanic Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, an idea proposed by a geographer named Alfred Crosby, was a way of trying to connect the world not just by intent, but by accident. And as we learned with COVID, there are many things that move around the world that are far outside of our control. The Columbian Exchange, in a short-term, a very simple form, is the global exchange of biota, of different biological organisms, from bugs to plants to mammals and even humans. And this has changed our world. If we expand our scope to include the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, we think of something larger, a Magellanic exchange of commodities that came out of this early expedition. Sugar, as my title meant to suggest, was one of those early commodities that moved across the globe from the Far East to the Far West, transforming as it went. Sugar originates in Southeast Asia, or perhaps New Guinea, and as it was moving westward, the Spanish and Portuguese took it out into the Atlantic, to the Canary Islands, to Madeira, and then to the Caribbean and Brazil. But sugar needs spice. It turns out sugar is relatively easy to move from one tropical climate to another. Not so with these spices. You might recognize cardamom on the upper left, cinnamon on the upper right, various types of pepper from Indonesia on the bottom. These spices, many of them were really only found in one or two islands or in very specific microclimates on those islands. And it was the search for those spices, the desire to monopolize access to those spices that drove Magellan and Elcano to risk their lives. Cloves on the Moluccas, as they were called, were one of the first objects of desire. But it was important, as Professor Phillips mentioned, to try to determine where the Tordesillas line lay in the Far East. And this was really the source of dispute, because the Spice Islands were unique. They had the things that Europeans wanted and that they wanted to have absolute control over. It was about making alliances with local headmen or local sultans in Ternate and Tidore. And both islands had access to cloves. So the Portuguese focused on one and the Spanish on the other, until the Dutch arrived to spoil everything. When the Dutch came into the picture with big guns, big ships, and huge ambitions under Jan Pieterszoon Koen, he was the governor of the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. They stepped in to try to intervene, but the Spanish and Portuguese both clung to their local alliances. And it ended up being a fight between the Dutch and the English at a nearby island called Amboina, or Ambon, as it is called today. And 2 books have recently come out about this fight between the English and the Dutch. So all of these 4 European kingdoms were struggling for access, exclusive access to cloves, and also nutmeg and mace. And nutmeg and mace were only found on these islands, the Banda Islands. The Bandanese islanders had long traded with Muslim merchants and other merchants, Malay merchants, who came from as far away as the Indian Ocean, as far away as the Arabian Sea. But it turns out that the Bandanese islanders were massacred by the Dutch in 1621. This was an early case of a rather atrocious act of conquest, and Amitav Ghosh has recently written about it. The Nutmeg's Curse is a book that just came out, in which he ponders globalization in a way that should make us think back on the Elcano-Magellan effect. I visited Guetaria last summer and happened to see this statue commemorating Elcano and to view the beautiful seaside at that wonderful city. And it made me think back on the complexity of the story, wondering what Elcano might have thought of today's globalization, today's nationalisms, today's concerns, but also of the spice trade. And so I would invite you to think about a global drink, a global spiced punch. In the end, we know that these men sailed in search of commodities. They found what they were looking for. And despite the world's great size, they managed to shrink it. One of the most surprising things about this voyage to me is that they found the things they were looking for, and that Elcano made it home. It's really quite astonishing. Thank you, and cheers.
Seguimos. Thank you, Chris. Ida Altman received her PhD from the Johns Hopkins University in 1982 and taught at the University of New Orleans prior to her appointment as professor of history at the University of Florida. She is the author and co-author or editor of books and articles on early modern Spain, Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic world. They include Immigrants in Society, Extremadura and Spanish America in the 16th century, Transatlantic Ties in the Spanish Empire, Brihuega, Spain, and Puebla, Mexico, 1560 to 1620, the War for Mexico's West, Indians and Spaniards in New Galicia, 1524 to 1550, the Spanish Caribbean and the Atlantic world in the long 16th century, and most recently, life and society in the early Spanish Caribbean, the Greater Antilles, 1493 to 1550. Ida, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, It's an honor to be here, Your Majesty, distinguished audience. For Thursday, December 16, 1610, the renowned Mexican historian and analyst Chimo Paín recorded the arrival in Mexico City of an extraordinary group consisting of an ambassador from the court of the emperor of distant Japan and his entourage. He described their dress and appearance in detail, noting that, quote, they seem bold, not gentle and meek people, going about like eagles, although he also noted that their long hair and lack of beards made them resemble women. Chimo Paín wrote that the purpose of the embassy was to establish peace between their peoples and facilitate the free conduct of business. Several of the Japanese were baptized and took Spanish names. Most returned home after a couple of months, but 3 actually remained in Mexico. 3 years later, in March 1614, an even larger party arrived with the, quote, lordly emissary and ambassador Hasekura Tsunenaga, who planned to journey to Rome to meet with the Pope and, quote, to give him their obedience concerning the Holy Church. And he did go to Rome, but that didn't, the Christianity part didn't work out too well. Chimo Paín's interest in the Japanese embassies and careful recording of details relating to their appearance and mission exemplify some of the complex human and cultural connections that resulted from the encircling of the globe by men like Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, and Elcano, and those who sailed with them and those who followed. Chimo Paín was a native of Chalco in central Mexico, born in the last quarter of the 16th century. He wrote extensively in his native language, Nahuatl, using the European alphabet that had been introduced by Spanish friars not long after Spaniards established dominion over central Mexico. The emissaries who arrived from Japan were by no means the first people who went to Mexico from Asia. Starting in the late 1560s, not long after the Spaniards established themselves in Manila in the Philippines, a trans-Pacific slave trade began to convey captives who were sold as slaves in Mexico. These captives, who could originate anywhere in East Africa, the Indian Ocean, South or Southeast Asia, or the Philippines, were known as chinos. As a resident of Mexico City, Chimo Paín probably would have encountered enslaved Asians, but he recognized the imperial embassies as being distinct and clearly worthy of being entered into the historical record. His descriptions of the Japanese, which included attention to distinctions of rank and the objectives of their mission, reflect both his curiosity and his intellectual sophistication. The convergence of Iberian, Nahuatl, and Japanese cultures in early 17th century Mexico City is but one of innumerable examples of the complicated repercussions and ramifications of the transoceanic movements that got underway in the late 15th and early 16th centuries as Europeans entered the spheres of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. To be sure, mobility and migration were fundamentally important throughout human history. Over many millennia, people moved individually and collectively over short and long distances, pushed out of familiar places, or attracted to new ones that offered different or more abundant resources, more favorable climates, or distance from rivals. Yet with rare exceptions, as we know from, say, the astonishing navigational accomplishments of Polynesian sailors, humans, for the most part, have moved in stages from the familiar to the unfamiliar, usually in relatively small numbers and relatively small distances. The opening of new overseas territories to European expansion and economic enterprises resulted in movements that were unprecedented in size and distance. Some of this movement was voluntary, much of it was coerced. A great deal of movement among indigenous populations continued after Europeans arrived in the Americas, both related and unrelated to their intrusion, and again, both voluntary and involuntary. The resulting reshuffling of human groups changed landscapes and relationships. Europeans went to the Caribbean in substantial numbers, beginning with Columbus's voyage of 1493 and accelerating as word of discoveries of gold in the islands got back to Spain. The peoples of the region had been moving around the islands and between mainland and islands for millennia, pursuing trade and other activities and maintaining significant inter-island connections. Although these patterns continued, the dimensions and nature of this movement changed after contact. Local people fled to neighboring islands or into mountainous interiors in order to avoid the newcomers and their demands for labor and gold. Spaniards themselves set off substantial movement by conducting large-scale slaving raids in places like the Bahamas, which they called useless islands because they didn't have gold, and elsewhere, relocating captives to places where they needed labor. As a result, coerced laborers in places like Hispaniola and Cuba soon came to include captives brought from the Bahamas, Yucatan, Mexico, Central America, and even Brazil. Spaniards' initial efforts in the Caribbean focused on the large and populous island of Hispaniola. But as they began to move to other islands, they took local people with them as servants and slaves. These dislocations and relocations continued as Spaniards expanded into the Isthmian area and the mainland. They took large numbers of enslaved captives from Nicaragua to Peru, for example. They also recruited large numbers of indigenous fighters for their campaigns of conquest, which also could produce new patterns of settlement and change the ethno-linguistic map. Compounding and further complicating the ongoing movements of Europeans and indigenous Americans were the ever-growing numbers of enslaved captives transported from Africa across the Atlantic. Slavery certainly, I missed something, oops, sorry. Slavery certainly wasn't new in the age of Iberian expansion. It had ancient roots in the Mediterranean world. The increasing Iberian presence along the West African coasts and islands of the Atlantic in the 15th century, spearheaded by the Portuguese, however, led to the development of commerce in captive humans on a whole new scale. The transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans would have enormous implications for societies and economies all over the Americas, as eventually millions of men, women, and children would be taken forcibly from Africa in the 16th century then, as indigenous populations in many areas dropped sharply as a result of European aggression, exploitation, and diseases, Spaniards and Portuguese turned to Africans to act as their aides and to provide labor in a variety of situations, from military campaigns to construction, mining, stock raising, and agriculture. For both Europeans and Africans, the transatlantic voyage often was only the beginning of their geographical itineraries. In the Americas, Africans and African-descended people escaped the control of their would-be masters, sometimes making common cause with Indians who also fled Spanish and Portuguese control. Others who gained their freedom moved into places that promised more opportunities and autonomy. Europeans also moved on to places where they hoped to find new opportunities or reunite with family or friends. Europeans, Indians, and Blacks vied for geographic space or attempted to distance themselves from others in their quest for independence. Spaniards appropriated indigenous sites for their towns and cities. After they overcame and claimed the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, they made it their own capital and brought African slaves who were about as numerous there as Europeans after the conquest. Yet despite the destruction and mortality that resulted from the Spaniards' siege of the city, many former indigenous residents returned to their old neighborhoods. Spaniards might have claimed the symbolic centers of indigenous sites for themselves, but their need for labor meant that they would share those spaces with Native Americans and with the Africans and Asians who arrived via the transatlantic and trans-Pacific slave trades. Thus, the shifting of populations on both the macro and micro levels reconfigured geographical space and spatial relationships, sometimes with astonishing rapidity. In 1530, barely 2 decades after Spain occupied Puerto Rico, for example, the largest group of people living on the islands were neither the native inhabitants nor the Spaniards, but rather Africans, or African descendant people. The apparent potential of the new territories that were opening to European ambitions attracted a range of people. Well before the Spanish and Portuguese crowns were united under Philip II in 1580, Portuguese were ubiquitous in the ostensibly Spanish Caribbean, not only as merchants, but also as much desired by Spanish authorities as settlers, a role they'd already played in the Canaries to the Spanish crown's satisfaction. Columbus was only the first of many Genoese and other Italians who became active in the Caribbean. German merchants and miners went to Spanish America, while the French arrived as corsairs and would-be colonists who contended with the Portuguese in Brazil and the Spanish in Florida. The English were somewhat slower to respond to the opportunities overseas, but they, along with the Portuguese and French, were fishing off the coast of Newfoundland. To the surprise of Spanish authorities, an English ship arrived in the harbor of Santo Domingo in 1527, ostensibly by chance, having fled cold, starvation, and hostile natives in Newfoundland. Such encounters were both the product and the engine of the numerous and increasingly close connections that were forged as people moved around the globe. As they did so, their identities could shift. Chimol Paín noted that the Japanese baptized in Mexico City took new names. Portuguese Jewish merchants based in Amsterdam and later in the Caribbean, who as Dutch subjects operated rather freely in Spanish realms, typically used Iberian as well as their Hebrew names. In this shifting and dynamic world where so many were exploited, some people found space to fashion or refashion themselves in unexpected ways. Historian David Wheat has written about Catalina de Santos, a self-identified mulatta woman who originated in the Caribbean, traveled with her slaves and servants as a ship owner and merchant to the Canaries in Seville, and returned to live and marry in Santo Domingo. Tatiana Sejas and others have written about another highly unusual woman, Catarina de San Juan, who arrived from India via Manila as a slave in Mexico in the early 17th century. Taken to live in Puebla, after several years, she gained her freedom and a reputation as a holy woman, and is still revered as such in the city. Subsequently, her fame spread well beyond Puebla, not because of her holiness, but because of a particular costume that came to be associated with her, although it actually seems to date from the late 19th century. Improbable as it is, the custom of the China Poblana, today incorporating the colors of the Mexican flag, ostensibly designed by a woman born in Asia, enslaved, and transported across the Pacific, came to be considered traditional Mexican dress. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ida. Well, so far, Carla, Chris, and Ida have discussed the implications of the Magellan-Elcano voyage in various realms that we've just heard. The voyage itself, the rush for commodities modeled upon Magellan's and Elcano's quest for spices in the Spice Islands, the movement, resettling of peoples around the world, the Americas in particular. I will limit my remarks, and I will be brief because I'd like to have time for questions. I want to devote what I'm going to say to with specific reference to what Joyce Chaplin in her book, Round About the Earth, Circumnavigation from Magellan to Orbit, referred to as the rise of, quote, planetary consciousness. And that planetary consciousness that took root in the immediate wake of the that's the first one, the immediate wake of the Elcano's successful return to Europe. Whether or not Magellan and company actually planned the circumnavigation, let's open, some people discuss this all the time. What's clear is that upon Elcano's return and in his appearance at the royal court of Charles V, the young, did I get that next one? Oh, I missed, sorry. The young monarch, clearly apprised of what Elcano had been accomplished, presented the mariner with a coat of arms inscribed in Latin, primus circumdediste me, you first encircled me. The monarch's newfound planetary consciousness cannot be doubted. It figured, for example, in his decision to support another voyage to the Spice Islands in 1526, and it also manifested itself in the negotiations that he engaged with the Portuguese crown over the exact location of the anti-meridian, and that is to say, the extension of the line of Tordesillas. Where did it lie in Asia? That led to what we call a bit of cartographic chicanery. As both sides, nobody really knew what they were talking about, they manipulated maps, Portuguese to move that line in their favor, the Spanish moved it in their direction, and one of these characters is Juan de Vespucci, who worked in the House of Trade in Seville. And those negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Saragossa in 1529. It was a treaty that basically worked in Portugal's favor as it divided the earth in somewhat unequal portions. Portugal's portion was roughly 191 degrees of the Earth's circumference, whereas Spain's portion was roughly 169 degrees. But that difference, perhaps it was the reason, did not prevent Charles from pushing claims to the Philippines, an archipelago that was named after his son, Philip, the future king of Spain, Philip II. And to reinforce that claim, in a specially commissioned atlas presented to Philip in 1543, he was about 16 or 17 years old, it traced the route of Magellan's voyage and saying, son, this is where he went, and these are yours. Don't forget it. And that claim is one that Philip never forgot. I love this little miniature where you can see Philip II's global aspirations, his planetary consciousness as he reaches up into the heavens with God the Father, bestowing world dominion upon Philip II. And some years later, and I'm going to be moving ahead, after he united this Portuguese crown and its overseas possessions into the Spanish monarchy, there was this interesting coin that was stamped in 1582 with Philip II on one side and on the doors, non sufficit orbis. The world is not enough. I want more. Planetary consciousness, perhaps even reaching up into the heavens at like. In a sense, almost in Putin-like fashion, Philip at that point may have aspired to further territorial acquisitions around the globe. Now, Philip's aspirations for world empire did not go unchallenged, especially after Francis Drake's great circumnavigation in 1580, which basically followed Magellan's route, although he stopped off to attack Spanish port towns in the Americas along the way. And the success of Drake's voyage subsequently encouraged England's ruler, Elizabeth I, to support more overseas ventures and the establishment of new colonies. As the iconography of this, her famed Armada portrait, suggests. And there you see her, dripping with pearls, those commodities, Chris, those commodities. And those pearls probably came from the Americas, because she was fishing in the waters of the King of Spain, as the famous phrase goes, with her right hand resting on the globe, planetary consciousness, her fingers covering the Americas, and the dreams of establishing colonies in the New World and beyond. And the Queen is also flanked by two columns behind her, probably a reference to the famous impresa of Charles V, Philip II's father, which represented the pillars of Hercules and the idea of going beyond, plus ultra, even further, going beyond to the globe itself. Well, territorial aspirations aside, the planetary consciousness spawned by the Magellan-Elcano voyage manifested itself in other ways. News of that voyage was initially disseminated in various publications, notably in Antonio Pigafetta's onboard account, first published in 1525, and in that same year, in another account by Maximilian Transylvanus, a secretary of Charles V. And he published another report on the voyage. And together with that of Pigafetta, these reports of the voyage served as a catalyst for maps depicting the planet as a whole. And I think this planetary consciousness is well reflected in Cosimo de' Medici's decision to incorporate into Florence's Palazzo Vecchio in a special Sala de Carta Geografiche, or map room, which depicted the world in 54 maps. Emergent planetary consciousness also manifested itself in the production of various geographical compendia that were truly global in scope. One of the most famous being the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, 1570. Philip II had maps of the world, various parts of the world, in his throne room to think about that global consciousness. Or you can think of the Civitatis Orbis Terrarum, a town atlas first published in 1572 with town plans and views of cities and smaller towns in what was called the four parts of the world in those days. And then somewhat later, we have the Grand Voyage of Theodore de Brie, with individual volumes devoted to America, Africa, and Asia. Well, planetary consciousness also manifests itself in a growing kind of industry for globes, as we can see in this painting from 1530, where you have Atlas holding up the heavens with a globe the Earth right in the middle. That's the older geocentric idea of the universe. You can see this actual globe dating from the 1530s. 1536, and I love the Hans Holbein's portrait of the two French ambassadors at the court in London, with globes showing their interests in power on a really a planetary scale. You find something of the same in new interest in the customs and habits and dress of people in different continents. This is the book, one of the first is 1541, John Boehnus's Customs of the World. Or I particularly like this one, Cesare Vecellio's Abiti Antichi e Moderni di Tutto il Mondo, Venice. This is the 1598 edition, was done before. People were interested in what were these people on the other side of the world? What did they look like? How did they dress? And you see it in manuscripts as well. This Portuguese manuscript, which now in Rome, depicting for the first time for Europeans, people in Java and in the Spice Islands. Or in the famous Boxer Codex, named after a British historian, Charles Boxer, which is now, this codex is in Bloomington, Indiana, where it depicts the arrival of a Spanish ship in the Philippines in the 1590s. And whoever produced it, and there's probably several authors, produced various pictures of nobles who lived in what is now the Spice Islands, as well as the ordinary people who lived there as well. And if that was not enough, there's a new industry in what we call global histories, writing the history of the world that really never existed before. Antonio Galvez published one of the first discoveries of the world, 1563. Antonio Targa Ganotta, Historia del Mondo, first published in 1562. François Belforet, a French scholar, Histoire universelle, and there were many, many more. In a sense, global consciousness, planetary consciousness, is becoming well ingrained by the 17th century. We can see it in New Spanish's voyages of exploration, sponsored by Philip II and Philip II at the start of the 17th century. We can see it manifested even in places like Peru, where a native scholar, Juan Ampoma de Ayala, produces his own Mappa Mundi, world map of the Indies. It was limited to the Indies, but it shows you that this scholar, he's kind of a scholar, he was thinking in global terms. We can see it as well in Pierre de Avité's volumes depicting various parts of the world with that wonderful engraving in the frontispiece. And there you see various people with a globe in the middle and the word Yahweh for God up in the heavens. We see it as well in this wonderful set of silver sculptures donated by a Spanish queen, Queen Mariana de Austria, to the Cathedral of Toledo, which depicts in silver what was then called the 4 parts of the world: Africa, America, Asia, and Europe. And we can see it in the popularity of world travelers. Books like this, the Carreri's Voyage Around the World, which was published in the late 17th century. We're thinking globally at this time, well before what we think about now. These people are thinking of the world in planetary terms. And we can see it more. It develops in the 18th century. There's more books on depicting the various peoples and costumes of the world, how they lived, how they differed from Europeans. We can see it in new voyages of exploration, starting in the 18th century, Captain Cook and others. There's Captain Cook. I'm going fast. Excuse me, I went back. Sorry, I should have said that was Malaspina. I went back. Richard, you went too fast. Well, I can't go back. Malaspina's voyage to the Pacific in the 1790s. And then, we'll go forward. And then, of course, planetary Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. Phineas Fogg took an opposite route of Elcano and Magellan. He went, if I'm not mistaken, he traveled east. The other guys traveled west. So in a sense, already well established by the 19th century was the planetary consciousness that we take for granted today. Thank you very much. Now, I see we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. If you raise your hand, I will call you out, and then Isabel will come around and let's give a mic to that right there. Oh, over there. On the other side, can you get through? Maybe can you talk loud? If you stand up.
Okay, this is a very improvised question. I love the presentation. I want to thank the Queen of Spain. I could only think of someone before her time, 400 years ago, Isabella de Portugal, that was a magnificent queen. She was not a queen, she was an empress, the wife of Charles I and the Emperor Charles V of Germany. And I want to thank her for her contribution to the prestige of the Spanish monarchy, as such as it is right now, and with what happened in the past. My question is, and this is just an improvised question because I've seen the word colony often mentioned throughout the entire presentation, and I would like to ask you, I know the answer, or at least I think I know the answer, but I would like to get your point of view. My question is simple. The word colonies often used in connection with Spain, but Spain in reality had an infrastructure and a way of administration of their territories that it was not colonial. The concept of colony, as it was, we'll have to go back to the Phoenicians perhaps to have something prior to that we could compare it to. But the Spanish had in the Americas and in Asia and other territories throughout the world, a type of administration that was similar to the one in Spain.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, and I'd like to finish my thoughts so you can give me your point of view, the chief or the person that was in charge of administering the law of the king or the person that was in charge of representing the king was a viceroy. And the structure of the territories was not such as a colony because they want to have the same things that Spain had, perhaps palaces, cathedrals, hospitals, universities. That's the most important to me. And the local people had also friars and people that learned the local languages and tried to preserve it for the quality of the empire, because this empire was diverse. And like you're saying, they were thinking in terms of planetary consciousness.
Yes.
So in terms of the importance of the trip of Juan Sebastián Elcano and Magallanes, I like to say it in Spanish because it sounds to me more, I will say, closed. I mean, I don't like it so much with the English accent. I like to say how it is in Spanish. So my question is, colonies versus viceroyalties, why are we not phrasing the things how they are, and the contribution of Spain to the world as it is now? United States, for example, is a federation.
Excuse me, we have the question.
Okay.
How about an answer?
Sorry if I took too long to express myself.
Chris, you want to take that? Chris, you want to take that? You're the expert Latin American history.
If I understand correctly, there's a concern about whether the use of the term colony versus viceroyalty. There is some debate among historians about whether or not these were colonies or kingdoms. And so the use of the term Nueva España, el Nuevo Reino de Granada, the way those terms were used and how they functioned politically suggested that they were something distinct from, say, an outpost, as in the Spice Islands, where the Spanish truly had a colony. They had a post to control only one of those islands, and they hung on to it. So what I would say is that there's really quite a wide variety from the very earliest times. Whether or not we use the term colony correctly today, I think it's probably overused and maybe misapplied. But keep an open mind. I think it's important to do that because there were many different types of connections between the Kingdom of Castile and various other kingdoms. And some of those were very close connections, and some of them were very tenuous.
Another question? And then in the back, there's one in the back, way in the back, and then this gentleman here.
Hello, thank you. I'd like, to question, the table. Why do you believe, that being, as it is, that more than half of the current United States was once part of Spain, and that there are hundreds of cities in the United States, hundreds, that bear Spanish names? Why most Americans, the majority of Americans, ignore this fact, and they keep talking about the 13 colonies as the origin of the United States, when the oldest city in the current United States is San Agustin in Florida, that was founded 200 years before the Mayflower arrived, in the East Coast of the United States. What is your opinion? Why, this is not taught in, the U.S. schools and universities, and why, accordingly, the majority of Americans ignore these facts?
Should I take that question? Yes. I'm going to do that.
Thank you.
Well, the first history, you're right. If you live in Los Angeles, or if you live in San Antonio, you know who was there first. But the history writing of the American colonies began in New England. And it began by the sons and heirs of Anglo-Saxons who arrived, or British, who arrived in New England. And you can, I don't want to blame Harvard, Yale, or Columbia, but to a certain degree, it's those institutions or people from that part of the world that started writing the history of North America first. Now, in a sense, they created what the historians call the paradigm for what American history is, and it also survives to this day in the New York Times 1619 project, which dates the arrival of black slavery in America to a ship that arrived in Virginia 1619, where we know that there was many slaves here in Florida starting in the 1580s. And in St. Augustine. So you have to redo the 1619 project, whatever you think of it. But the important thing is, starting already in the 1820s and 1830s, people like Thomas Buckingham Smith here in Florida, and George Fairbanks, if I think he's got his name right, started to rewrite that history, to write a more Spanish-oriented history, looking for Spanish origins of North America. And that gained momentum, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. But in the end, and I'm not Harvard, Harvard wins the day. It's people like Morrison or George Bancroft were the great 19th century, or Francis Parkman, New Englanders who wrote a history of the Americas that was modeled on New England, and it grew from there. And it took a long time for the Spanish-oriented writers to catch up. And you're right, we still have a lot of catching up to do. No, there was somebody here. Yeah. And then maybe we have to...
Thank you. So,
yes.
Can you hear me?
This is, I think, the last question.
Is it on?
Yes.
All right. So, I mean, very quickly, the way I understood the first question is that Spain didn't have colonies the way that the England had colonies or the French had colonies in Africa. It's just not the same. That's the way I understood the first question. But my question is really about slavery. It's almost impossible to attend like any type of presentation or read a book about Spanish exploration without hearing about slavery and all of that. So, but it's never in context. My impression is that whenever we talk about slavery and Spanish slavery, I don't hear what the other countries were doing at the time. I don't hear whether, say, in Mexico, even though it wasn't really Mexico, was there a slavery there? Were tribes like treating each other respectfully? I don't hear about slavery in Africa, which is the Spanish and the Portuguese were buying slaves, but the slaves were actually being captured by Arabs in Africa, so within Africa. I don't hear about slavery in the Romans, right? So shouldn't we give context so that people stop thinking about Spain and Portugal as the bad Europeans and the English as the good Europeans, which is what I hear in a lot of presentations. And thank you for your time.
Ida, do you want to take that? Or do you want to take it? Or you both take it?
You know, by talking about Spain and Portugal and their involvement in these slave trades from Africa and across the Pacific and also in the Americas themselves, I mean, that is not to say that other people were not doing much the same. As it happens, the Spanish and Portuguese were the first ones to become actively involved in the slave trade with Africa, and it's true. They did not go into the interior of Africa. They were reliant upon African rulers and leaders and traders to supply them with slaves. I don't think that by denying the reality of slavery, we gain anything in terms of understanding our history. Indigenous slavery was practiced among some groups. It existed in Mexico before the Spanish arrived. The Spanish took advantage of that, and they, because they thought, okay, they're already slaves. We can buy them, we can use them, and so on. I agree with you that I think, it's important to look at the particular context of these kinds of practices. But I don't think it doesn't help us anything to say, oh, well, everyone else was doing it too. It is true. Yes, the British were, the French were, the Dutch were, of course. Excuse me? I just said that, yes. That indigenous slavery did exist in some parts of the Americas.
I'd like to end with a plug for a book that my husband wrote, William Phillips. And it's Slavery from Roman Times until the Beginning of the Atlantic Trade. In other words, slavery, unfortunately, is about as old as human history. But my husband tries to go through all of the centuries and talk about what it meant. And it means a lot of different things in a lot of different places. So it's a complex topic. I think we can probably agree it's a complex topic. But I do recommend his book. And he's spent the last 20 years revising it, and it's about to come out in a second edition.
I appreciate plugs like that. And another book I can recommend is Andres Resendez's The Other Slavery, which examines slaving practices among indigenous peoples in North America. It's a wonderful book. And in a sense, it focuses attention on that aspect of a problem which we all are all too sadly aware of today. But thank you to the members of the panel for your excellent presentations. Thank you, Your Majesty, for your patience and being with us today. And thank you all for coming this evening.